Hello, my name is Ninni Wahlström. I am a professor of education at Linnaeus University in Sweden. The title of my presentation is School and the Democratic Hope, the School as a Space for Civic Literacy. In accordance with the conference theme, Education and Society, the aim of this paper is to explore the role of the school beyond those aspects that are viewed as immediately possible to measure, assess, and compare, and to draw attention to the task of a school in a democratic society and the accomplishment of this task. The research question is, how can we explore the role of a school to uphold and strengthen democracy in times when the meaning of liberal democracy is being challenged and the democratic form of governance at the national level is being questioned? The very notion of public education reflects the task of a compulsory school to educate students for the offer and responsibility to engage in public life. Today, democratic values are being challenged in many Western countries, even in countries with a long democratic tradition. Liberal democracies have diminished over the past decade from 41 countries to 32 in 2020, with a population share of only 14% of the world population. The level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2020 is down to the levels last found around 1990, while electoral autocracies continue to be the most common regime type globally. Therefore, it's increasingly vital to discuss how we, as educational researchers, address the question of a school as a primary social institution for broad citizenship education. School and society function as interconnected vessels. They are both dependent on each other for their development. Perhaps the biggest problem is that in established democracies, we tend to take democracy for granted. However, democracy is not a natural phenomenon that brings people together. We are not born as democrats. Democracy is rather a form of cultivated imagination in which we are asked to also imagine and understand the perspectives of others. Democracy is a way of life which takes concrete expressions in everyday practices. The most serious threat to democracy comes from democracy itself, when the democratic attitude becomes eroded from within. Tomorrow's adults need to be educated on the conditions of democracy, both as a way of living together respectfully and as a governance system, and the place in which they can be educated for democracy is the school. The logic of democracy is a public education which constitutes the basis for informed citizenship. Public schools do not mean only publicly financed, but are also the places for how a public, a citizenry, is made. A main argument I will put forward in this presentation is that school, as part of society, is vulnerable in relation to political and educational policy aspirations. At the same time, the daily teachings at school can be a space for maintaining democratic norms and a democratic way of living together. There has been extensive research during the last 2 decades which has shown that economic goals, competition, and market logic dominate international policy discourses, resulting in a policy of numbers, comparisons, and outcomes-based curricula, threatening to narrow the meaning of education. Professor of Philosophy and Politics Nancy Fraser termed this neoliberal hegemony as progressive neoliberalism. She argued that it is a result of an odd alliance between liberal currents of feminism, anti-racism, environmentalism, and LGBTQ rights movements on the one hand and the financial sector on the other hand. These two very different fields were held together by a distinctive view of distribution in the field of economy and recognition in the field of moral and culture in terms of respect and belonging. According to Fraser, the aim of neoliberalism was to liberalize and globalize the capitalist economy. In reality, this meant deregulating, denationalizing, re-understanding the role of the state, and dismantling barriers to promote the free movement of capital. To get this questionable economic politics of distribution accepted and hegemonic, it needed to be connected to progressive movements of recognition, hence the expression progressive neoliberalism. It fails to acknowledge the structural institutional factors underpinning injustices in the neoliberal view of both distribution and recognition. Instead, progressive neoliberalism transforms both distribution and recognition into individual responsibilities. The consequences of this international neoliberalist hegemony is that the meaning of democracy, in terms of liberal democracy, including institutional regulations for both economic redistribution and recognition of minorities, is under pressure. A second challenge to democracy derives from the counterpart to progressive neoliberalism, namely reactionary liberalism. It combines similar neoliberal politics of distribution with a reactionary and exclusionary politics of recognition, characterized by an agenda of nationalism, patriarchalism, and homophobia. During the late 2010s, the influence of right-wing nationalist parties in Europe grew, and in several countries, they are part of governments or government collaborations. They accept democracy in terms of popular sovereignty and majority, but reject liberal democracy, that is, the establishment of institutions for the protection of fundamental rights, such as freedom of expression and protection of minorities. Right-wing populism is based on the assumption that society comprises two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite. The democratic challenge lies in a populist thinking of a people as a homogeneous group with one and the same will, which risks leading to restrictions in the liberal democracy's protection of minorities by influencing the judiciary and by efforts to limit the perspectives of diversity in areas such as media, culture, and education. A third current challenge to democracy is the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. The year 2020 became a year of lockdown. Another general reflex has been the view that the danger came from a point outside one's own country, thus the borders between countries have to a large extent been closed. Overall, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic has required governments to undertake a series of emergency measures that temporarily removed some democratic and civil rights. Most countries have restricted public gatherings and citizens' freedoms of movement, and more than 50 countries have declared states of emergency. Thus, governments have temporarily expanded their executive power and restricted individual rights. There is a risk that experiences of restrictions about how people can meet and move in society and across borders will affect people's trust in other people, in society, and trust in other countries. During the 21st century, goals or competencies adapted to national economic development have become increasingly emphasized, not least because of the close relationships between international and national educational policy arenas. Thus, there is a need for a clearly formulated purpose of compulsory schooling and a definition of a meaning with citizenship education. As will be argued in this paper, citizenship education should include three different targets: to equip students with skills that lay the foundation for coping with working life, to prepare students to act as citizens willing to engage in various common issues, and to contribute to giving students the opportunity to live a rich personal life. All three purposes require an open and free society. In the following, citizenship education will be explored through the concept of civic literacy. The point of departure for this exploration is primarily the philosophy of pragmatism as it has been developed by American educationalist John Dewey, because pragmatic inquiry shares a discourse ethics with democracy. Developing students' civic literacy is not primarily about offering courses in civics, even if formal courses on the theme are important as well. Rather, civic literacy, as the term is used here, is about adopting a democratic stance in all school subjects taught by the school. According to Barber, the term civic literacy includes a competency to participate and act with consideration and deliberation in a pluralistic world, to think critically and to act with empathy in relation to others despite potential conflicts of interests. Drawing on Dewey's text, Democracy, the Task Before Us, we can emphasize two basic insights related to the meaning of civic literacy. The first insight is the need for democracy to recreate itself in relation to changes in the development of society and changes in people's way of working, communicating, and living their lives. The second insight is that democracy takes place and develops locally through communication in the social spaces in our neighborhoods and in everyday lives. Both understandings point to an element of creativity and openness in the concept of democracy, because we cannot know in advance exactly what the concept of democracy will comprise in relation to current and future periods of time, and what can be thought of as the common good. The link between education and adopting a democratic stance can be further developed by the philosophical concept of transactional realism, a pragmatist theory on knowing. Dewey thought of what he termed scientific thinking as a prerequisite for a democratic society. In the term scientific thinking, he included free inquiry, toleration of diverse opinions, and free communication, because he understood scientific thinking as essentially social in nature. The aim of education is to educate children and young people to deliberate both on judgments of facts and on moral values related to facts. In all aspects of life, communication is central. Through communication, people get a common understanding of aims, beliefs, aspirations, and knowledge. People live together in society because of the things and norms they have in common, and the way they get things and norms in common is through communication. The way we can understand the world around us is through our experiences of it. Dewey placed the concept of experience in a wider ecological relation between an organism and its environment. An organism or an individual is always already embedded in an environment from the beginning. The natural world, with all its physical objects, exists independently of the organism. What constitutes the environment is those parts of a physical and social world with which an organism or an individual interacts. This interaction between an individual and his or her environment is a transaction because of a changed relationships between the individual and the environment that arise as a consequence of the experience. The experienced object has got a new meaning, and the one who experienced has widened her knowledge. Because of this transactional process by which the world is incorporated in the concept of experience, experience is not a subjective expression. Instead, experience is the means by which humans can get valid knowledge about the world through their transactions with their environment. This version of Dewey realism is called transactional or natural realism. For Dewey, society is a space which includes various unsolved problems, sometimes without actual solutions. The only way to handle these challenges is through communication among citizens across their controversies, conflicts, and differences. People need to share their interests with others, deliberate on different complex issues, and learn from each other's perspectives. Including in a democratic way of life, Dewey argued, is the belief that the expression of difference is not only a right of the other persons, but is a means of enriching one's own life experience. The common ground for education and democracy is constituted by an experiential approach to getting knowledge about the world, based on the concepts of experience and communication. An open and free search for knowledge requires a free society without social barriers. A democratic society, on the other hand, requires engaged and knowledgeable citizens with an interest in reflective thinking and deliberation. When the process of reflective thinking leads to new insights, which are added and integrated into previous experiences, which leads to increasingly complex experiences, there is what Dewey called growth. According to Levin, growth is a naturalistic term for what is called bildung in a German tradition of knowledge. In bildung, the dynamic between the individual and the culture is placed at the center. The core issue in bildung is to develop one's own individuality. The interest in and learning from culture was seen as a reciprocal process of actualizing the individual character of a self and of re-understanding the meaning embedded in cultural expressions. To develop knowledge about the world is a contested enterprise. The curriculum theory question on what knowledge is of most worth can be answered in various ways depending on the basic perspective of knowledge in policy and curricula. Turning back to the term civic literacy, it's now possible to discuss the potential meaning of the term from a perspective of transactional realism and bildung. The two curriculum traditions, social reconstructionism and critical constructive didactique, based on the knowledge philosophies of pragmatism and bildung, respectively, both represent curriculum knowledge traditions that connect subject knowledge with a societal perspective. Both knowledge approaches include reflection on relations between subject-specific knowledge and skills on the one hand, and social or cultural conditions and perspectives on the other hand. To develop knowledge of a world includes both to know facts and to think reflectively about them. When taking the kind of actions as to be able to reflect on or be able to argue seriously, these abilities cannot be viewed as general competencies. Rather, They need to be understood in relation to an actual knowledge content and a genuine effort to understand an issue from its various aspects. You need to reflect on something, an issue that you have some knowledge about, or an argument for something you both are familiar with and believe in. Otherwise, it's about empty exercises without any knowledge development involved. Thus, the reflective and critical element of civic literacy needs to be included in the different school subjects, adapted to the conditions for the different knowledge traditions of natural science, social studies, aesthetics, and so on. A learning environment which opens up relationships between the teaching content, the student, and the social, biological, and physical environment constitutes the core in developing knowledge of a world. At the same time, this approach educates students in developing a democratic stance. Seeking answers beyond what is already given and obvious in terms of facts is an important part of civic literacy. To learn to act responsible in the world denotes the ability to engage in common interests based on well-founded arguments and respect for those directly and indirectly affected by the communication. Communications with indirect consequences, also for those not directly involved in the communication, can be characterized as public. When teachers and students together deliberate on issues with potential consequences for different groups in society, they simultaneously constitute a public. In his theory of interpretation, German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer emphasized the significance of striving to understand what the speaker is saying from the speaker's context and tradition, and not just from your own. When we truly try to listen from the other person's perspective, we are at the same time putting some of our own prejudice at stake. However, if we do not expose our prejudice in the face of others, we do not get the opportunity to know ourselves either. To realize oneself in the world means to strive to develop one's own individual potential. Self-realization is about establishing active relationships between one's own specific capacities and the particular environments that promote the well-being and growth of oneself. This relationship between individual capacities and environment is one of mutual adjustment that transforms both the individual and the environment. Included in the ethical and aesthetical endeavor of self-realization is both appreciation and criticism. While appreciation denotes a personal awareness and understanding of what one has experienced, criticism represents the public aspects of what has been experienced. This public aspect of criticism involves a re-education of our perceptions, which help us see things in continuous new ways. Elliot Eisner argued for using two types of educational objectives, both instructional and expressive goals. While instructional objectives form a predefined model of a curriculum, stating what knowledge the students are expected to achieve, expressive objectives formulate the problems with which the students are expected to cope and the tasks with which they are to engage. Drawing primarily on transactional realism, while acknowledging the affinity of some of its characteristics with bildung, it is now possible to more closely define the three cornerstones of civic literacy as discussed so far: to develop knowledge about the world, to learn to act responsible in the world, and to realize oneself in the world. First, to develop knowledge about the world includes an intellectual aspect of civic literacy built on the basic idea that humans are always in a continuous transaction with the physical and social world around them, which highlights the importance of trying to understand facts from a broader perspective. In what context does this particular knowledge become important? What different forms of relationships do these particular facts have to individuals and society? And what consequences do these factors have for different social groups? This implies a focus on relationships and consequences for the various phenomena that are included in the content of teaching. In other words, it is not enough to teach inwards towards a discipline or a subject matter. The content of teaching also needs to be directed outwards and forward towards the physical and social world around the students and into the future. Consequently, to develop knowledge about the world means more than being able to present facts about it. It includes careful inquiries in both practical and moral matters of relations and consequences on what is taught. That is, it requires reflective thinking. Reflective thinking is always about reflecting on something for some purpose. That is, to find out possibilities, risks, and constraints with a phenomenon at hand. Thus, reflective thinking is not an inner process, but a process of sharing and communication with others in one form or the other. These kinds of inquiries and reflective thinking in the classroom place the students in their role as part of the public and as citizens in society here and now. Second, civic literacy includes acting responsible in a world of pluralism. This moral aspect of civic literacy is closely related to the aspect of developing knowledge about the world. To learn to act responsible in the world includes being accurate with one's use of facts and making efforts to base one's reasoning on actual knowledge. This is a central element of being respectful to others. Another important element is to learn to listen from a perspective that is not one's own. From such a position, one not only learns more about others' conditions, but one also gets to learn about oneself. A third element in acting responsible in a world is civility. As an individual, one constitutes the environment with which others transact directly or indirectly, or but ever so slightly. Thirdly, civic literacy is about getting the opportunity to realize oneself in the world by expressing substantiated proposals and standpoints, as well as participating in context of shared interests to fulfill one's individual potential, independent of social barriers. Self-realization represents an aesthetic aspect of civic literacy, which includes both a personal element of appreciation and a public aspect of criticism, helping the individual see things in new ways, that is, to learn from the transactions with different social contexts throughout life. From a perspective of an aesthetic ideal of being both thoughtful and fair in social participation, the combination of instructional and expressive goals represents a creative approach to promoting self-realization. All teachers encounter different forms of problems that are related to the education policy rather than to the individual school or teacher. An example of such problem, which is outside the responsibility of the individual teacher, but which nevertheless affects the conditions for teaching, is the problem of school segregation. Residential segregation, in combination with a school system that is unable to bridge social differences between schools, can contribute to very different conditions for different schools and different teaching contexts. A problem with the purpose of schooling concerns a too one-sided emphasis on the task of knowledge achievement, which risks to lead to a subordination of broader social goals of equity and inclusion in compulsory school. Related to an emphasis on knowledge achievement and a national endeavor of raising standards is standards-based curriculum with prescribed requirements for knowledge for different school years. The problem with standardized prescribed goals is the external and administrative nature of the expressed demands of knowledge, formulated at a large distance from both teachers and students. A restricted and prescriptive curriculum with a narrow focus on knowledge outcomes implicates a limited space for teacher agency regarding decisions on teaching contents and teaching repertoires because of national systems of knowledge tests and accountability. The more trust in the professionalism of the teachers, the more space for teacher-based actions. However, despite the kinds of problems depicted here, an individual teacher, in most cases, can choose to adopt a democratic stance in the selection of his or her own teaching content and open up the world in all its complexity and conflicting interests to the students. A civic literacy, educating the student to develop knowledge about the world, to learn to act responsible in the world, and to realize oneself in the world, is of vital concern for education in all school subjects to prepare students not only for working life, but also to take responsibility as citizens in challenged democracies. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.